Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, and the topic for today is the cheapest way to meet rising electricity demand. Today's date is July 29th, 2026, and we have an excellent guest speaker with us today. But before I pass it over to him, I'd like to go over a few webinar logistics. All attendees are in listen-only mode, so your webcam and microphone are disabled. The chat function is also disabled for attendees, so if you would like to submit questions and comments, you can do so via the Q&A panel. We'll be saving about 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the presentation to address audience questions, so please feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar through the Q&A function, and we will get to them at the end. Automated captions are available if you click the CC button. Speakers' bios will be made available in the chat as he's being introduced. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. We will email you a webinar recording within 48 hours, and it will also be posted on CESA's website at cesa.org/webinars. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to our host for today, CESA Executive Director Warren Leon.
Hey, thanks very much, Serene. Before we get into the webinar itself, let me say a couple things about CESA. We're a national membership organization. Our members are mostly state energy agencies. We have members in 20 states. And if we look at the next slide, you can see here logos of our various members across the country. We do a lot of information sharing among them. We have working groups tackling projects of interest. We do group projects. We identify best practices. And today we're going to be talking about identifying some issues that are of current interest and also some policies as well. And what we're going to focus on today is this report you see on your screen. It's an important recent report from Energy Innovation, which is a nonpartisan think tank. Now, energy innovation is adept at conducting sophisticated objective analysis that feeds into climate-related policy design. And our speaker will be the report's lead author, Brendan Pierpont, who is Director for Electricity at Energy Innovation. He leads research and analysis of electricity sector policies for the organization, and his work spans critical issues such as affordability, reliability, and clean energy policy. He has over 15 years of experience as an analyst, researcher, and consultant. And we're going to be leaving a good amount of time for questions today, maybe even more than 15 or 20 minutes. So please feel free to put your questions into the question area, and we'll be asking them later. So let me just turn it over to Brendan, and he's going to give his presentation, and then we'll have questions. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Warren, and thank you for hosting me on this in this conversation. Let me pull up my slides so you can all see. Great. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm excited to talk through some of the findings of our recent research and modeling analysis on the best way to meet rising demand. So I think we all know that this is a really challenging and dynamic time in the power sector. We have rapidly rising electricity demand, primarily driven by the growth of data centers, but there's other drivers of that demand growth as well, things like electrification of buildings and transportation and industry. We also have policy headwinds and development headwinds for wind and solar and new transmission. There's increasing constraints on the supply chains for gas turbines and other components that go into the electric sector. And we have federal orders to keep coal plants open that have planned retirements. This sort of interference with the planning and kind of operation of the electricity markets. And so, in this moment of uh, turmoil in the electric sector, we really wanted to ask, can we meet this growing demand with clean energy? Is the clean energy path still the cheapest path? And we wanted to explore these questions. Zooming in on electric demand growth right now, one thing that's very notable about these recent trends is that they're uneven across the country. If you look in one location to another, uh, there's a very different story. So, in Northern Virginia, in Data Center Alley, uh, there continues to be a large number of new data centers being proposed and built, as well as in Georgia, in parts of Texas, in parts of Ohio and Illinois. There's these hot spots for growth, and so one of the important elements of this study is to really recognize that regional variation as we're doing this analysis. So, what did we do in this analysis? Well, we conducted a national analysis using an open source capacity expansion modeling tool called Switch. This is an electricity planning model. It uses publicly available inputs and is available as an open source model as well. Uh, we conducted this with granular inputs. We represented 134 grid zones across the country. That previous map was breaking out the load growth across those grid zones, so you could see where where this the granularity of this model. This model also had hourly resolution for sample days, including difficult days to essentially stress test the reliability of these systems. We did a lot of work to validate the resource costs against recent market data. We know that the prices of gas turbines, of new wind projects, of battery storage projects are all changing fairly rapidly. And we wanted to make sure that we were using resource cost assumptions that were up to date and tested against this recent market data. We also wanted to utilize a recent industry load growth forecast that really represents uh, what utilities themselves are projecting. Of course, that brings in a number of the biases that those utility load growth forecasts may have, some of the speculative nature of this demand growth. But we wanted to make sure that we were representing what the utilities themselves and grid operators themselves may be seeing. And then finally, this work is near term. So this modeling is a snapshot of 2030, and that really is intended to be a direct link to the decisions that are being made by policymakers today. Um, the procurement decisions, the permitting decisions, the things that happen today are really going to affect the direction of travel over these next 5 years. And this is also corresponding with the timeline of a pretty significant data center build out. And so we really wanted to test here what's the best path for this near-term load growth. Our approach in this modeling was to set up two scenarios. And these can both be thought of as current policy scenarios, but they have, at least at the federal level, but these have very different outcomes and different constraints applied to them. So on the one hand, we represented a high fossil scenario, and this is really intended to represent the current direction of travel of administration policy uh, to limit wind and solar development. We still allowed the model to meet binding state clean energy policies and build projects that were under construction. But we also in this scenario uh, we had the model block any planned coal retirements. Uh, on the other hand, we modeled a clean energy scenario, and this is a scenario where we accelerate the deployment of solar and sustain the deployment of wind out to 2030 to levels that represent what we thought of as kind of the high end of ambition for deployment nationally. Um, we also allowed those announced coal plant retirements to go forward and allowed the model to select additional economic retirements. And then key to this scenario, we leveraged the demand side, and so we wanted to make sure that this clean energy portfolio, the way that we meet this load growth, also incorporated energy efficiency and peak demand flexibility. So that's a part of this clean energy scenario. And so these two pathways are really dramatically different ways of meeting near-term demand growth as we'll see as we get into the results. So first, just some description of what these two futures look like. These graphs represent on the right-hand side installed capacity of different types of resources. And on the left-hand side, installed capacity. On the right-hand side, annual generation, actual electricity produced over the course of the year from different resources. Um, and each of these graphs has a 2025 column, which represents actuals as of recent data, as well as our 2030 scenarios for high fossil and for clean. So you can see that the clean scenario installs significantly more wind and solar than the high fossil scenario over time. It meets that demand growth and then some with that increase in clean energy deployment, whereas the high fossil scenario is primarily meeting new demand growth with increasing the use of existing coal and gas and building some additional new gas. So zooming into some key findings from this work. First, meeting demand growth with clean energy is cheaper. So our we saw that on net, uh, meeting this demand growth in the high fossil case would increase the system costs around $30 billion per year in that high fossil case. It's around $5 billion lower of an increase with the clean case, around $25 billion per year. So that's $5 billion of savings per year with this much more ambitious clean energy future for meeting demand growth. The savings that we're capturing here are primarily driven by reduced fuel costs and reduced operation and maintenance costs from retirement of expensive, inefficient plants, as well as offsetting just the usage of many coal and gas plants. But those savings are somewhat offset by the need for new capital investment in this clean system, and the cost of enabling demand response and energy efficiency at the scale that we're talking about. So the net of these two is a savings of around $5 billion per year in our base case. We also know that fossil fuel prices are very volatile. This is a graph that shows the cost of natural gas at Henry Hub, which is a common trading location for natural gas as a commodity. That's in the blue line. And then coal prices in three different basins across the country. And you can see that in this graph, you can see the volatility of natural gas, which I think we all know and experience in our day-to-day lives. But I think less talked about is that coal prices, particularly those coal prices in the eastern part of the country, have tended to follow the volatility of natural gas somewhat. And so if you look at 2022, which was really the biggest recent year of volatility in these fuel prices, driven by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the European energy crisis that resulted in it. We saw fuel prices across the US spike up during that time. You saw natural gas prices jump by a factor of four, but you also saw coal prices, primarily in the eastern region, also follow natural gas prices up. So we know that these fossil fuel prices are volatile and that volatility has a really significant cost impact on the electricity markets and on electricity customers. So one of the things that we wanted to do in this study was look at the impact of that price volatility under these two scenarios, these two near-term pathways for meeting load growth. So we looked at a sensitivity where fuel prices rise to 2022 levels and found that the savings increase by $8 billion per year. So they go from that 5 billion per year in savings in our base fuel price assumptions to over $13 billion per year under these high fuel costs. So as fuel costs are higher, the savings of going clean increases. This really shows that a clean pathway is significantly a significant hedge against that fuel price risk. And that's important because we are headed by everything I have read, we're headed into a period of more, not less, uncertainty in fuel prices. We have growing geopolitical uncertainty globally. We have increasing demand on our natural gas in the US and increasing exports of that natural gas that further link our domestic markets with international markets. And analysts from Wood Mackenzie to Bloomberg New Energy Finance have all pointed to these conditions as a structural driver of higher gas prices in the future. So it's really important as we're thinking about this future of how we meet demand growth. How do we make that demand that pathway future proof so that we are mitigating these risks as we're making the decisions? Another large source of uncertainty is that demand growth itself. A lot of data center load growth proposals are highly speculative. We've seen in some cases, near-term demand forecasts being revised downward as data centers are not built as quickly as they originally thought they would be built. We also see utilities that create a large load tariff mechanism for data centers to actually make a financial commitment. And AEP, one utility, created a long-term contract mechanism for large loads. And when they issued that, their pipeline of new data centers, new large loads, dropped by over half, nearly two-thirds, as very few of what was in their pipeline actually made a financial commitment to move forward. So we know that there's a lot of uncertainty here. And so we wanted to test the effect of that uncertainty. So we looked at a sensitivity where demand grows at 1/3 of the rate that we're expecting in the base case. But in both of these cases that we've built the system for that high load growth case. This is a way of saying, are there regrets if we pursue this clean case and that demand doesn't show up? And we find that even under this low demand growth case, there are still savings from going clean. The savings are lower because the costs of the system overall is lower. But those savings are still there, even if that demand doesn't show up. And that's because even without the scale of demand growth or this lower level of demand growth, that clean energy still reduces fuel costs, still reduces the operations and maintenance costs, and drives those savings. And finally, a clean energy system is reliable. So This is one of the areas where we spent a lot of time in our modeling to make sure that we were having a very robust assessment of reliability. So in our modeling, we tested each of these 2030 portfolios against 7 years of hourly weather data. And that's downscaled to these 134 different load zones across the country. Uh, this is a rigorous approach to reliability. We tested these systems um, and added any challenging days, any days that there was a risk of a shortfall of being able to meet demand. We added those days to the capacity expansion modeling and iterated until there were no days with any unserved load in any region across all 7 years. So this was a very rigorous way of approaching reliability. It's not the traditional you have a capacity market with a planning reserve margin and a capacity contribution of each resource. This is really looking at the performance of all of these different resources hour by hour across the system. And we found by doing this that we were able to really give ourselves confidence that this is a system that could operate, that could meet the needs of a growing load, a growing electricity system. So, what do we do to enable this clean pathway? There's savings on the table, there's risk reduction on the table, but we need to make sure that we're making the decisions today that will enable us to get on this cleaner pathway to realize those benefits. We identified 6 key policy actions. These are in broad buckets, setting ambitious clean energy targets and accelerating implementation of these targets, really just at a high level, setting the direction of travel. We also identified reducing permitting and interconnection barriers for new clean energy projects. These are two of the primary barriers that are often cited as what is holding back the rate of our ability to add new clean energy projects to the system. Um, and permitting and interconnection are two of the big ones, though there are other barriers as well. Uh, we also identified improving electricity system planning. I mentioned earlier the work that we did to make sure that our cost inputs were validated against recent market data. We saw that new natural gas prices, new natural gas turbine prices have increased almost 2 to 3 times what they were just a few years ago. At the same time, battery storage continues to decline in cost. And so we wanted to make sure in this modeling and recommend that utilities, as they're conducting planning, do something similar. Make sure that we're using updated cost assumptions for different resources, and make sure that we're also, given the uncertainty in demand forecasts, updating those demand assumptions so that we're not making decisions on stale data. One way of doing that is through something called all source procurement on the cost side, where you actually just go out to the market and say, what would it cost and what are the performance characteristics of a whole bunch of different resources, whether that's wind and solar and energy storage, or new dispatchable capacity, or demand side resources like energy efficiency and virtual power plants and other load flexibility options. It's important to put all of those options on an equal playing field, look at the costs, look at the performance, and see what's cost effective. Another area of policy uh, that will help enable this clean energy system to move forward is strengthening fuel risk management so that utilities have an incentive to protect customers from price volatility. This can be in the planning process, looking at a variety of fuel price futures and forecasts and seeing how different portfolios perform under those conditions. And it can be in the cost recovery process using things like um, fuel cost sharing to help um, allocate some of the risk of fuel price spikes to those utilities so they have a financial incentive to manage them. We want to maximize the use of the existing grid through modernization, grid enhancing technologies, using things like reconductoring to get more out of existing transmission corridors. There is a lot that can be done using the existing infrastructure more efficiently and getting improving our utilization of that infrastructure. And then finally, harnessing the demand side through efficiency, through demand response, through virtual power plants is another important area. I wanted to highlight just a couple of examples. This is not comprehensive by any means of specific states. These may be your states that are doing interesting work in a few of these areas. So Illinois um, is a really interesting example of reducing barriers for those state and local permitting processes. As a state, they've set minimum standards for local siting that help prevent overly restrictive rules or overly restrictive permit requirements at the county level or local level. And they've implemented a state backstop process, which allows a kind of a check to make sure that those local rules are fair. And this is a really interesting balance of it's not the state sort of usurping local authority, but it's making sure that the things can happen at the local level in an efficient way. Another interesting example, in Indiana, there's been some policy movement that helps get more out of the grid. So there's new policy requirements um, that utilities in their planning processes need to look at the opportunity for something called surplus interconnection. And surplus interconnection is a way of connecting additional resources to existing points of interconnection to make better use of those points of interconnection. We have uh, peaking power plants across the country that may use their interconnections 10% of the time or less. And that's 90% of the time that all of that equipment, all of that capacity to deliver power across the grid goes unutilized. And so there's an opportunity there to make better use of those existing points of interconnection and those existing interconnection rights. Um, so Indiana is requiring utilities to look at this opportunity in their planning processes. Can they meet new capacity and energy resource needs with this opportunity? And in Minnesota, um, there's some really interesting work to harness resources on the demand side. Not without some controversy, but regulators approved a program for Xcel Energy in Minnesota to deploy 200 megawatts of storage across their distribution system in 1 or 2 megawatt increments, which is a really interesting moving from those large scale battery installations, large utility scale battery installations to smaller distribution sited storage. Another really interesting opportunity. There's many states that are doing very innovative things on harnessing the demand side. So I'm highlighting one interesting example here, but there's many more, and I'm sure you all have countless examples of these as well. So uh, that's all the content that I've prepared to talk through today. For more information, please download the report from our website. There is the full report that looks at sort of all of these modeling scenarios in detail. It has a long technical appendix that explains the modeling and has more results. And it has a companion policy report that goes into these policy areas in more detail as well. Also, feel free to reach out to me. My email is on this slide. Feel free to reach out if you have questions or want to follow up on anything in particular. And thank you so much for your time and attention today. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A.
Hey, thanks very much, Brendan, for a very interesting presentation. We got a lot of questions, and some of them are more challenging than others. Let me start with a relatively easy one. Um, it seems that your predictions and data are reserved to current sources of clean energy and don't include the opportunity for new sources of clean energy. Did you consider the potential of new technologies coming online between now and 2030?
That is a great question. And it's one that we, as a team of analysts, thought about a lot. By looking at this near-term window, our assumption was generally that projects that are not in development already for those new innovative clean energy sources, and I'm thinking of things like advanced nuclear, advanced geothermal, maybe long duration energy storage. We may see some isolated small scale deployments of those resources, but the real potential to scale to multi-gigawatt deployments in the next 5 years for these new technologies seems relatively limited. And so that was one of the constraints that we put on this model was essentially we are not going to see a rapid scale up in some of these new technologies. We really do have to depend on the ones that are scalable and commercially available today. I think if we looked out beyond 2030, if we looked at 2035, 2040, those technologies could play a really meaningful role in the system. One other constraint that I didn't mention in the presentation, but we looked at transmission in a similar lens. We used existing transmission um, uh, capacities between zones in the model and did not allow the model to add new transmission capacity. Um, beyond what was already existing for the same reason, because it takes much more than 5 years to develop significant interregional transmission capacity. And so as we're looking to 2030, as we're looking to this like near term load growth crunch, we really wanted to represent this set of constraints that we feel like this is a reasonable, realistic pathway for deployment, where we're not making too large of bets on technologies that are going to take a little bit longer to deploy at scale.
Great. And in terms of your projection, what battery technologies were assumed to be used?
Yes, our battery technology assumptions are based on lithium-ion batteries as the primary driver. One interesting element of this modeling, though, is that um, we we're not just representing like 4-hour lithium-ion batteries. We are letting the model choose the duration of batteries that's optimal for the mix. So it can say if it's more optimal to add more battery packs for the same inverter and interconnection size, it could choose 5 or 6 or 8 hour batteries. I don't have the number off the top of my head what the kind of national average duration is, but I think that's one important element of this is that lithium-ion batteries, it can actually be pretty cheap to add additional duration, and if that's valuable to the model, it selects it.
Well, good. Let me ask you the questions from folks who are skeptical of your clean scenario about its being achievable. And let me read a couple of comments. One person writes 500 gigawatts of solar and 233 gigawatts of wind is about what China has done in the past 18 months. Do we have the work infrastructure and workforce to achieve that? And someone else said, you're essentially doubling the current installed solar capacity in 4 years. And if a project's not currently in the interconnection queue, is it really possible for it to come online by 2030? So how did you come up with these figures, and do you consider it possible?
Yes, so the these are just so that for clarity's sake, the 500 gigawatts of solar and 233 gigawatts of wind are what we expect to be the total installed capacity in 2030. So including existing resources, but that's true that that's a significant ramp up in the rate of deployment of solar in particular. What we based those on is solar has shown for a lot of its history an ability to grow deployment year over year at a pretty significant pace, well over 20% per year in deployment growth. So that deployment growth year over year is what we based that trajectory on. We wanted to say if we started where we were in or where we expect to be in 2026 and grow year over year at a very steady clip, um, that compounding growth allows us to get to a total installed solar base of 500 gigawatts by 2030. I don't, again, have that growth rate memorized in my head, and I'm happy to follow up with the questioner on that question. Um, but I do believe that the industry is capable of that year over year growth, even as it gets into larger and larger deployments. Now, yes, it's true that there are barriers to growing that quickly, and interconnection is one of them. Local siting and permitting is another. And that's why policy action is needed on these issues to unlock and accelerate that growth. And so things like using surplus interconnection to connect more resources to the grid, um, having more efficient general interconnection processes and studies so that projects aren't waiting 5 years to get through that process and online. Having more flexible interconnection approaches, both at the wholesale bulk system level and at the kind of local distribution level for resources to come online. There's a lot of things that can be done that policymakers can do to help the deployment of these resources go faster. I think our modeling is really intended to show what's the prize if we are able to unlock this.
Great, thanks. Before we go further, I do want to report to people based on a few questions. The webinar slides and the webinar recording will both appear on the CESA website, and everybody who registered for this webinar will get a notice indicating that those materials are available. They'll be up in a day or two. But someone else was asking about not the clean scenario, the fossil fuel scenario, and they were talking about the recent revelations that the Trump administration has been blocking decisions around energy projects in blue states that had voted against President Trump in the last election. Does your analysis make any assumptions as to on the fossil fuel scenarios about where solar and wind projects are and aren't able to move forward?
That's a great question. In some ways, we may be overly optimistic about clean energy deployment in states with uh, binding clean energy standards and renewable portfolio standards, because that fossil scenario still is assuming that those mandatory state laws are met. Um, and and that really becomes the ceiling in that fossil scenario for clean energy deployment nationally is meeting those state law requirements. If those state portfolio standards aren't met, you could imagine that fossil scenario uh, having less clean energy deployment and potentially costing more as a result. We did not impose constraints on any sort of geographic basis. We to model this, we essentially limited the amount of clean energy growth just to um, what was required by state policies or those projects that were currently under construction.
Okay, thanks. Well, there are several questions that all relate to cost and cost of the clean
Hmm.
energy scenario in different ways. And one person writes, it's unclear if your data for clean energy is related to startup costs or long-term costs, such things as loss of farmland, recyclability of solar panels and wind turbines, etc. Are you only including the initial costs?
That's a good question. We based our cost assumptions largely on the I guess it's now National Lab of the Rockies annual technology baseline. They do a cost review of projects and cost estimates going forward that are of different technologies for solar, for wind, for energy storage. And then, as I mentioned, we looked at that information and then validated it against industry cost projections, data on what projects were actually coming in at. And that validation step, we saw uh, new natural gas plants were significantly more expensive than the kind of cost estimates. Um, Wind also is significantly it was more aligned with the NLR's conservative case for wind costs. Solar, the middle of the road case was pretty well aligned with industry cost estimates, and then energy storage has been outperforming those cost estimates, and so we used a more advanced case for energy storage. Those costs represent the upfront capital costs, the development costs, and including any sort of bonding and insurance and remediation or decommissioning costs that are embedded in the project costs. Um, though I think that's going to vary from one developer to another, one locality to another, what those actually look like. So that could vary quite a bit from one place to another. Um, and but to the extent that there's sort of policy in place that ensures that those decommissioning costs are embedded, and that's usually the case if you're building large capital investment, that at the end of its life, it needs to be decommissioned. That cost is usually part of the project cost. It's financed over the life of the project cost, like other costs.
And someone else is asking about would the cost for the clean scenario be higher than you project because of the fact if one really were to try to ramp up clean energy generation, there would be supply shortages, and you'd have some of the same problems with clean energy technologies that we now have with gas turbines.
I think that that's a really important question, and the one of the reasons why we have a policy recommendation around expanding and implementing ambitious clean energy standards, setting those goals sets the market signal in the long term that there is a market for these technologies. And that has a very important impact on industry rather than having this kind of vast uncertainty of how big the market will be, which can constrain investment in the supply chain and constrain the investments in scaling up different elements that could be uh, constraints on that deployment growth and impact the cost of that deployment growth. Setting goals and targets actually has this transformative impact on markets. And I think that that is a really important thing for policymakers to consider and keep in mind as we're negotiating this phase. And but I think uh, there's a few other things that are important to keep in mind here is that much of the cost of deployment of solar and wind and battery storage in the US is not the equipment costs, it's soft costs, it's development costs, it's interconnection costs to the grid. And so even if there is some rising pressure on those supply chains, there's a lot that can be done to reduce the cost of these projects through more efficient permitting and interconnection policies, for example.
That's a very interesting point. Thank you. We have some complicated and difficult questions for you here. You could decide whether you could respond to this one or not. Someone asked, can you comment on Lazard's levelized cost of energy and how those numbers as data points can be helpful when evaluating various generation resources versus what the metrics are lacking in terms of broader system-wide costs that must be considered to compare apples to apples?
That's it's an ongoing debate, how to look at those levelized cost numbers. I I think they are useful if you understand the caveats. And the caveats are that different technologies have different performance characteristics and different value to the energy system. So the production profile of wind or of solar, it might not perfectly align with when energy is has the highest value or when capacity on the system is needed the most. What matters, so they are good indications, especially if you track over time of uh, the the just cost of energy from different resource. They don't tell you anything about the value of the energy that's produced by that resource, and I think that's worth keeping in mind. And that's why these types of modeling exercises are important because the next step after understanding the cost of individual resources is understanding how do you put those resources together into a portfolio and how does that portfolio perform on cost and on reliability and on the other metrics that we care about. Because when you have fairly low cost wind and solar resources, you need to couple those with flexibility and reliability supporting resources like energy storage, like demand side management and virtual power plants, these types of resources. You also are putting those into a system that has existing capacity, like the existing uh, gas resources that we have across the system, and that changes the operation of the system at large. So these types of modeling exercises are about how do you take those individual resources and put them together into a portfolio. So I, like many other analysts, look at the Lazard study when it comes out every year. I'm very curious about sort of how they what they're estimating and how things have changed from the previous year. But it's not the be all end all of what resources are belong in that portfolio. You need to take the next step.
Thank you. Someone writes, if storage is modeled at the distribution level, it should escape interconnection queues in addition to avoiding transmission costs. Does that show up in your model in any way? Did you model that difference of escaping those costs?
We didn't explicitly model that. It's very difficult in a national model that has um, we're breaking the grid into 134 zones, but each of those zones is essentially a part of the transmission system. And so we're not getting down to the level of granularity of a distribution system. And it's a very challenging effort. I've seen a couple attempts to do that in the modeling community, but it's a very challenging effort to do that in this transmission level model. It is a really important point, though, that the distribution system both for storage and for solar and other resources, is a really important um, opportunity to add additional resources to the grid and add those close to where load is being served. Um, there's a lot of opportunities with flexible interconnection to the distribution system to add those distributed resources to manage them at the distribution level and serve some of that load directly or nearby. Um, but that's a utility by utility, state by state kind of regulatory decision making process to unlock that potential. I agree that there is a lot of value in building those resources at the distribution level. You can potentially defer additional distribution investments or reduce some of the energy losses from the transmission system or other sources of value that come by doing this on the distribution side. You could potentially do it faster if the utility has a more efficient distribution interconnection process or is really enabling that flexible interconnection to happen. But it's the devil's in the details, I guess, on how that gets implemented.
Well, one thing we do know is that the number of hotter days has been increasing in recent years. When you did this modeling, do you assume a stable climate between 2025 and 2030, or do you assume a gradually warming climate? And does that
That
affect the models in any way?
that is a great question. We do not make any specific adjustment uh, for increasing global warming, and that would you would assume that that would increase your air conditioning load. It would probably drive more uncertainty in your winter load as well. I think there's been some work to attribute these kind of more extreme but infrequent winter storm events to destabilizations in the climate system as well. And so that's a very we did not do that in this modeling. I have seen some utility planning processes that are starting to grapple with this question of making regional climate forecasts and embedding those into how they're assessing load growth and how they're assessing what their need for resources. But I think it's pretty early stages in the kind of electricity system planning world on really reflecting that changing climate in the demand forecasts. One thing that I found um, one thing that I think is very important to consider here, though, is that air conditioning load, especially as it becomes more a bigger driver of demand during heat waves, is also a really significant opportunity for demand response and virtual power plants. One example of a really interesting program that was really just deployed this summer was in New York, where um, I think it was a state agency working with a startup deployed thousands of portable batteries to renters' apartments that you can plug in your window AC unit into this portable battery, and then that becomes this demand response asset that can be called on the grid. I thought that was a really creative way of harnessing that air conditioning load as a demand response or virtual power plant type of resource. So there's certainly risks in that. There's also opportunities in it.
On the one hand, it's really impressive that you managed to do analysis at the level of 130 some odd different geographic areas. But someone was asking, a big state like California is represented by only four zones. If you had greater spatial resolution, would the impact have changed? Would you have had significant different results if you had divided the country into, instead of 130, 230 zones? Or do you feel confident you would have gotten very similar results?
I am fairly confident that we're in a pretty similar set of we'd get pretty similar results even with more geographic granularity. What greater granularity at the geographic level helps you do is a couple of things. You can represent some specific constraints. So, say if you're looking at California, there's there's probably much better data on siting potential and interconnection potential for new clean energy projects across the state of California. And that's not a matter of like how many load zones are you looking at. It's more of a matter of what other data can you bring into this type of analysis. Similarly, different regions have very different resource adequacy constructs in their current market designs and or current planning paradigms. And so when you're looking at a particular state, you can take those extra steps to represent something that's more of a like the actual policy for resource adequacy that the state has versus kind of a generic representation of an operable system in the way that we have. So it's that additional granularity. I think of it more as an opportunity to go deeper on the real world constraints and limits and data that can help inform that modeling at the local level.
Well, I'm going to ask you one more question and then I'll give you um, a minute or two for you to say anything else you wish you had had a chance to say and haven't had a chance to say yet. The last question has to do with the reception to this report. I know it's come out recently, but have you gotten any evidence of either utility representatives or media members or folks from red state um, governments taking your analysis and saying, oh, maybe they need to rethink a little their views about the fossil fuel versus clean energy future?
That is a great question. I think it's likely too early to tell in terms of that um, specific question. We have gotten a lot of positive reception from uh, both state and federal government officials that we've shared this report with and talked to. We've gotten great coverage of this in the press as well. Um, though I don't think I have heard anybody saying this report is going to change the way that they are doing things on the ground immediately. I am hopeful that uh, getting sort of good, clear information about what the best pathway forward in this time of near-term load growth is will actually it will help inform those decisions. But I have not heard kind of direct evidence of somebody reversing course and doing something entirely different as a result. So.
And do you have any famous last words for folks? Something you want to say and haven't had a chance to say yet?
Uh, I just wanted to say thank you to you, Warren, for hosting me on this, and thank you to all of the participants of this webinar for joining and spending an hour of your time. Um, I think it's really important at this time of uncertainty in the grid, in how we are meeting this load growth, to kind of take an objective look at what pathways are going to be the best way of meeting this. How do we design a system that's not just reactive to this near-term pressure, but is actually going to be robust to risks in the long run? And what's the policy toolkit to enable that to happen? So really thank you all for spending your time today hearing about this report and your excellent questions. Um, Please do reach out if you want to follow up on any of this, and I'm looking forward to that follow up as well. So
Great.
thank you so
And
much.
I do want to tell folks in terms of follow-up. I realize we haven't been able to get to all the questions. There are quite a few that came in. We will share the questions with Brendan afterwards, and he may be able to follow up with some of you if he has information to share. Brendan, thanks so much for doing this, but more than doing this webinar, I really want to thank you and your colleagues for having produced such an important and useful report. It was great to see it when it came out, and it's even better to learn more about it now. And thanks everybody for showing up, and we look forward to seeing you at future CESA webinars. Bye now.
Great. Thank you.